determinate being, Dasein. Dasein, as we see, is just the unity of being and nothing. And Hegel thinks that we get there because the vanishing that is constitutive of becoming itself vanishes through its own dynamic, settling into being and nothing as a unity. So we have to think a bit about that and why he might think that. And I'm going to give you my version of it probably several times, actually, if you don't mind. And then we'll look at the actual text and see whether what I say matches up with the text and see whether it makes sense, basically. So start with the idea that being and nothing vanish into one another. Being vanishes into nothing, vanishes into being, vanishes into nothing. And remember, they can't coexist. That's really important. In becoming, being and nothing do not coexist. Because being vanishes into nothing. Where there's nothing, there's no being. Nothing vanishes into being. Where there's being, there's no nothing. And there's not even the exclusion of it. It just is not there. So each vanishes, and in vanishing, we've been told earlier, the very difference between being and nothing itself vanishes. So, the beginning of the paragraph on becoming, Hegel writes, pure being and pure nothing are therefore the same. So each vanishes into the other, and in the process, the very difference between them vanishes. Keep that thought. And yet, each does not in fact vanish, but immediately re-emerges in its very vanishing, because each is the vanishing into the other. As such, each is the re-emergence of the other. Being vanishes into nothing, vanishes into being, which pops right back up again. Which vanishes into nothing, which also pops right back up again. So the very vanishing in which each vanishes and disappears, and the word is Hegel's verschwindet, and in which the difference between the two vanishes such that they prove to be both the same, equally indeterminate, is a movement in which, in fact, neither does actually vanish, because each re-emerges in the very vanishing of the other. So logically, their vanishing, if I put it this way, isn't what it is. It isn't the vanishing that it is. Now this is where there's an aspect of method that I think comes in. Hegel says in paragraph 88 of the Encyclopedia that the method is really just the positing of what's implicit, the rendering explicit of what's explicit. If we render it fully explicit then, what that vanishing is, implicitly, then it can't any longer just be the vanishing of being and nothing into one another, but must be their vanishing into their having vanished. And that term, by the way, in case you think I've made it up, the vanishedness is Hegel's. You find it in the third paragraph. The result is the vanishedness of becoming. Dieses Resultat ist das Verschwundensein. Having vanished. The having vanished of being and nothing can't, though, obviously be the complete and utter vanishing of each, because that would just regenerate the other and therefore regenerate itself. Where being vanishes completely, we have nothing. Where nothing vanishes completely, we have being. So the having vanished, in which both have vanished, can't simply return back to being a nothing. It's got to be the having vanished in which each has lost its purity, in which the purity of each has vanished. So how can the purity of each vanish? It can only vanish when they are in fact inseparable. One is inseparable from the other, and that unity is what Hegel thinks this vanishing settles into. So to picture this, if I can picture it, which of course is not allowed, but nonetheless. So if we think of So you have being, and you have nothing, and being vanishes into nothing, and nothing vanishes into being, and they just continue like that endlessly, which is the vanishing of the two and the disappearing of their difference, but such that each then re-emerges. But implicit in that, Hegel's thinking, is the genuine vanishing of the immediacy of the two of them. But that requires them not to vanish into one another, but to vanish into their having vanished, which is the unity of the two. Now, this is the result of their vanishing, such that each in its purity has now vanished. In the unity of being and nothing, there is no longer pure being. There is no longer pure nothing, and neither pops up again here. But this vanishes into this, but this is just the return to that. And that vanishes into that. So this vanishing as the process of vanishing, isn't actually the vanishing it is. It just is the re-emergence of the very thing that vanishes. And yet it is their vanishing. The vanishing in which they lose their purity, they lose their difference. Rendering that explicit is to think the two as vanishing into the unity in which their immediacy and purity has vanished. They vanish into their having vanished. But at that point, of course, there's nothing there any longer to move them to vanish. Because you're going to say, well, why did they vanish in the first place? They vanished in the first place because each was absolutely pure and immediate. But when the purity has been lost, there's nothing to make them vanish. And so the vanishing stops. So vanishing, becoming, settles through its own dynamic into this unity of being and nothing. And it does so by being, as it were, explicitly what it is. Hegel doesn't move from becoming to determinate being out of some kind of nostalgia for determinacy, which is what some people might say. You know, Hegel sort of plays with the idea of becoming, but he doesn't really like it. He likes settled identities. So, you know, let's get back there as quickly as we can. No. First of all, we're not getting back to anything, so we never had this. This is something new that is not present in being, it's not present in nothing, and it's not present there. This is a new constellation of thoughts, the unity of those two, which has so far not been present. And that it arises through the loss of the purity of those two. So this is what happens when being and nothing lose their purity. When they impurify themselves, they turn themselves into moments not just of this movement, but of their unity. All right, that's my version of what's going on. So let's see what Hegel says and whether it matches up, or what I say matches up to what he says, but obviously it's his version you've got to go with. Okay, so this is the sublation of becoming. The resultant equilibrium of coming to be and ceasing to be is in the first place becoming itself. But this equally settles into a stable unity. Being and unity, it should be in this equilibrium, not in this unity, because it's in im, not in ia. So it should be being and nothing are in this equilibrium only, I am becoming, only as, let me stop for a minute. This is really important, because he starts by talking about the resultant equilibrium, which is becoming. Then he says it settles into a stable unity. Then he talks about being and nothing being in this unity, and you think it's just the unity he's referred to, but it isn't. It's the equilibrium that he's talking about. So he's going back to talking about becoming. So being and nothing are in this equilibrium, in this becoming, only as vanishing moments. Yet becoming as such is only through their distinguishedness. Their vanishing, therefore, is the vanishing of becoming, or the vanishing of the vanishing itself. Becoming is an unstable unrest which settles into a stable result. being and nothing, let's go back again, are in becoming as vanishing moments. Yet becoming as such is only through their distinguishedness. Now why is that? Why does becoming live off the difference between being and nothing? Because it's only being in its purity as sheer being that vanishes. If being were not pure and immediate, and in that sense radically other than nothing, it wouldn't vanish. Parmenides' being doesn't vanish because it's got a settled identity. But pure being vanishes because it's purely what it is. Nothing vanishes because it's purely what it is. So, and the vanishing itself causes the other one to pop up again. So that's what he means by saying the vanishing is only through their distinguishedness. And yet, that vanishing is the vanishing of the two, the collapse of their difference. So it's got to be the collapse of the difference through which they vanish in the first place. But if it's the collapse of that difference through which they vanish, it's got to be the collapse of their very vanishing. The vanishing of the vanishing, the Verschwinden des Verschwindens, which gives you this. He has another go in the next paragraph. This could be expressed thus. Becoming is the vanishing of being in nothing and of nothing in being, and the vanishing of being in nothing generally. Überhaupt. But at the same time, again, it rests on the distinction between them. The distinction whose vanishing it is. It is therefore inherently self-contradictory because the determinations it unites with itself are opposed to each other, but such a union destroys itself. Now that's all you've got, that's all he says. But he then goes on to argue that the result then is the vanishedness, das Verschwundensein of becoming. But it's not nothing. As such, it would only be a relapse into one of the already sublated determinations, not the resultant of being and nothing. It is the unity of being and nothing which has settled into a stable oneness, stable now, because the moment of restless vanishing has itself vanished. But this stable oneness is being, yet no longer as a determination of its own, but as a determination of the whole, and goes on to name it, determinate or Dasein. Now, this movement of vanishing will come back again later. It will be generated again in the form of change. And that's, again, something important to recognize about Hegel's logic. If the logic he's following is right, then certain concepts arise, certain structures arise, and then through reasons peculiar to them, disappear. And then they come back again. So don't always expect everything that arises at a particular point to be there, as it were, forever. It depends on what you're thinking about. Okay, at this point, there's nothing much I can do apart from say the whole thing again, because there isn't really anything more to explain. But so I'll have a go, and I'll try not to overdo it, because I realise if I say it too much, it will just defeat the point of explaining it in the first place.
So just ask, are you saying there's only stability within the flux?
No, it's saying that the flux itself settles into stability.
Right.
This is not, so the flux disappears. And in fact, he uses that word advisedly, I think, verschwinden. The point of using the word verschwinden, by the way, you might think, well, that's a negative term. You know, haven't we been told that becoming is both coming to be and ceasing to be? Yes, indeed. So becoming as such has an affirmative and a negative aspect to it. It's creative and destructive, if you want to put it that way. But each aspect of becoming occurs through the disappearance of an original moment. So ceasing to be is the vanishing of being. Coming to be is the vanishing of nothing. That's because you start with those. So in fact, the whole dynamic of becoming is described in terms of this vanishing, verschwinden, this disappearing. And it's got two aspects to it, if you like. It's the vanishing of each of those into the other, first thought. And it's the vanishing of the very difference between them, second thought. And in fact, it's both the same, both at the same time. And yet, insofar as we stay with the notion of becoming, they're not being thought at the same time. Or rather, we're being, if you like, a little bit dishonest. We're thinking that the difference between being and nothing vanishes, but we're also thinking that it doesn't really vanish because it's re-established in the very movement of vanishing itself. So there's a sense in which what Hegel's trying to do in these paragraphs is, as it were, think vanishing sort of more honestly, more consistently, as what it is. Does that mean he's sticking with the logic of identity? Well, in some ways, yeah, but it's required by the very structure of becoming, he thinks. So becoming, as I say, is this movement of vanishing which is sustained by the difference. So let's say you don't like this movement. You know, you like Nietzsche, you like Heraclitus, you don't like all this stability stuff, you like becoming. From Hegel, what are you committing yourself to? You're committing yourself to the re-emergence of pure being and pure nothing. So really what you're holding on to is the very purity of being and nothing, through which the vanishing is generated in the first place. That's what it is to hold on to becoming as Hegel defined it. It's to hold on to purity. And yet at the same time, you're saying that the purity vanishes. You want it both ways. And not in a Hegelian sense, in a sense that even Hegel thinks is self-contradictory. Now, of course, there are other conceptions of becoming. Becoming that involves time, that involves generation, history. That's not what he's talking about. Okay? He's just talking about this becoming. A becoming that's generated by the very purity of these terms, but in which they're undermined, in which the very difference between them is lost, in which their purity is lost. So what we have to do, and this is an aspect of philosophical method at the start, is render explicit what it is for that purity to be lost, for it to vanish. What it is for this vanishing to be the vanishing that it pretends to be. And that is for the purity to actually disappear, such that we don't end up either with pure being or with pure nothing, but with the unity of the two, in which neither is purely what it is. That's the key. This unity is the impurity of both that results from becoming. So pure being has now gone. It's turned from something on its own, from its imagined self-subsistence, into a moment of a unity. And there will be never any point at which it comes back again in that form. You know, Derrida's not quite right. There are moments of loss in Hegel's thinking, and this is one of them. Now, being and nothing as moments are not lost. They are moments of the unity they constitute. But the radical, absolute, pure form in which they're present, that's now gone. And it's gone more here than it is there. That's the point, I think, that I'm trying to get across. Even if you have your reservations, keep them back of your head. In Hegel's mind, purity, the pure being, is lost more here than it is there. So, again, I'm putting this in a pointed way to make, this would need qualifying, it's unfair. But let's say it to make the point. If you want to be here, if you want to be Heraclitus, what you really want to be is Parmenides. Because the only way you can be Heraclitus is by being Parmenides. Because it's pure being that generates the becoming. If you really want to be Heraclitus, and you really want to think becoming, such that purity is lost, you've got to settle down into this and become, I don't know, Anaximander or who it is. You've got to actually move into the thought of being as determinate, being as limited, although limit comes later. So that is the dialectic. As I say, there's not much more I can say, I'm afraid. Apart from now trying to, go over it, you've got to go over it in your own mind, draw attention to certain things that are happening there. Okay, response to you. It doesn't mean there's stability in the flux. It means the flux logically settles into a unity in which it's disappeared. So we're now in a different logical space in which this logic no longer holds. So we have to think in a different way. If Hegel's right, what's produced determinate being is simply the immanent structure of becoming. Nothing else at all. Nothing else is at play. Note that this story is clearly different from the first one we had. The initial movement of being vanishing into nothing is structurally different from the vanishing of that vanishing. So you've got an example of the way that the logic doesn't always work in exactly the same way. And we've now got a new set of thoughts. And I think what I'm going to do is, if it's all right with you, is to push on with this so you get a picture of what Dasein is all about. And then maybe, if there's time here, or next week when you've had time to think about all this, we can start with a little discussion of what's going on. I don't want to stop you doing that, but I think that there might be more to be gained from sort of moving on a little bit. And this obviously is not any part of the story that Schelling tells. And I have to be fair, well, not fair, no, I have to be open about this. I think there are a lot of Hegel commentators that don't understand this. I really, really do. I'm not sure with Pippin, much though I have very high regard for what he does, but he understands this. Now, of course, I might be wrong. Obviously, that's always the case. But it seems to me a story that that makes sense, and I would at least ask you to think about this. Okay, so we're going to move now into Dasein, which is a lot easier. Once you've got the idea of being and nothing as a unity, then a lot of what Hegel goes on to say is actually reasonably straightforward. And the way to think about it is if we can just start with being and nothing as a unity. We can start with that idea. The development, the logical development of Dasein really consists in nothing other than sort of highlighting and doing justice to each of the moments that's involved. That's a simple way of doing it. Before we go and look at this, though, I think there is one thing that needs to be said here, and that is that if Hegel is right, he has derived the very idea of determinacy. Kant, remember, Kant's basic conceptual distinction is between something and nothing. And that's the classic Leibnizian question. Why is there something rather than nothing? We haven't got anywhere, well, we have got near something, but we haven't got something yet. We've just got the very idea that being must be determinate at all. So it can't just be indeterminate, it's got to be determinate. Kant certainly didn't think of deriving that, and most philosophers don't. Who the heck ever thinks that you need to derive the thought that being has to be determinate? Isn't it blindingly obvious that it's determinate or not determinate if you don't like determinacy? But Hegel has derived that. We haven't got very far, but what we do know is that you can't think determinate being without being and nothing being together in some way. All right, okay, now the opening of this section on determinate being has a couple of sort of false starts. In that chapter 2, determinate being, he's giving you an overview of what's going to come. It explains what's going to come, but it doesn't justify it. Then you get to determinate being as such. That gives you another overview of what's going to come in that little section. So we don't start properly until determinate being in general. That's chapter 2, section A, subsection A. So let me just read a couple of bits, and then I'll sort of comment on it. So from becoming, there issues determinate being. Okay. Is determinate being the right translation? The word is Dasein. Dasein. Di Giovanni translates that as existence, and there's some reason. So in the Di Giovanni translation, you'll have existence there. The problem is that there's another concept later on in essence called existence, which Di Giovanni then's got to translate as concrete existence. So he has existence and concrete existence, which I don't really like. Dasein is a perfect, it's a verbal noun created from Dasein, German, perfectly ordinary German word. Determinate being is an ugly phrase, an ugly sort of coinage, and it does leave you with a real problem if you're trying to translate a sentence like Das Dasein ist bestimmtes Sein, which means determinate being is determinate being, which is just sort of empty. So it's not a very satisfactory translation, which is why I might sometimes just refer to it as Dasein. Anyway, here it is. From becoming there issues determinate being, which is the simple oneness of being and nothing. Because of this oneness, it has the form of immediacy. Its mediation becoming lies behind it, It has subverted itself, and determinate being appears, therefore, as a first, as a starting point for the ensuing development. It is first of all in the one-sided determination of being, because of the immediacy with which it's first thought. The other determination, nothing, will likewise display itself in contrast to it. And that's what we're going to discover effectively. As it, what does Dasein prove to be when the moment of the negative moment, which is constitutive of Dasein, is given its due, is rendered fully explicit? That's what we'll see. So next paragraph, Dasein is not mere being, but determinate being, Dasein. And Hegel just emphasizes it in italicized, Dasein. Etymologically taken, being in a certain place. Because da is just the word for there. Hello, wer ist da? But the idea of space is irrelevant here. Determinate being, as the result of its becoming, is in general being with a non-being, such that this non-being is taken up into simple unity with being. Determinate being, as the result of its becoming, is in general being with a non-being, sein mit einem Nichtsein, such that this non-being is taken up into simple unity with being. So, Dasein is being with a non-being. Now you should notice already that Hegel's changed the terms, because it wasn't supposed to be that. It was supposed to be being and nothing, not being and non-being. But there's a reason why, in this new space, the term with which being is now associated has got to be more than just nothing. And the argument basically is this, that being is inseparable from the non, that is itself inseparable from being. So in fact, that has got to be, I may have to give up the ghost of one. I'll try another one. Let's see if this one works out. No, that's even worse. Just think among yourselves. You have to bring your own because they disappear from these rooms. Oh, look at that. They are brilliant. So, being is inseparable from the non, the not, nothing, that is itself inseparable from being. There is a thoroughgoing unity of being and nothing, in which neither is just what it is. So really, you need the two little circles like that. Being is inseparable from the non, which is inseparable from being. Ergo, being has got to be in unity with non-being. So that's the minimum we can think Dasein to be. Now that doesn't say very much, and you're probably thinking, what the heck is that? You're hoping more will come out of this. This is the least that being determinate can amount to. You can't have determinate being if you've just got being, and you can't have determinate being if you've just got non-being. You've got to have the two. That will eventually lead to the thought that being determinate is being this, not that, which is more familiar. Okay, so that's the first idea. Then he immediately goes on to another thought, focuses on non-being. Non-being, thus taken up into being in such a way that the concrete whole is in the form of being, of immediacy, constitutes determinateness as such, Bestimmtheit. So this non-being is Bestimmtheit, or determinateness. He just names it that. So the moment of determinacy that's added to being, to constitute determinate being, is this element of non-being. Bestimmtheit. If and when you ever get to the logic of essence, as I know some of you are at the minute, this is absolutely important, because Hegel will define certain structures in the logic of essence in terms of Bestimmtheit without any proper being. So Schein, for example, it has Bestimmtheit because it's not essence, but the whole point of it is that it lacks being. So you can uncouple these two from one another, but here they're not, they're associated together. So remember this, so when Hegel comes back later to the idea of determinacy, you know what it means. It just means the moment of non-being. There is a later term, Bestimmung, which is more complicated. Okay, so I'm hoping that's fine. I mean, all he's doing at the moment is sort of unpacking what is built into the very thought of the unity of being and nothing. The next paragraph I'm going to skip because that is just commenting on the difference between what is in our reflection. Kind of touches a little bit maybe on Tom's question earlier. The difference between what something is for us in our reflection and what it is actually posited to be. And Hegel's just noting here that there's a lot that is for us, as it were, that we can see in a concept that hasn't yet been explicitly posited in it. And he says about 7-8 lines down in that paragraph, only that which is posited in a Begriff belongs in the dialectical development of that Begriff, belongs to its content. There should be a comma actually after notion. Whereas the determinacy that is not yet posited in the concept itself belongs to our reflection, whether it concerns the nature of the concept itself or is an external comparison. So you can see the kind of split brain that's emerging at that point. That there's a lot we can say about this. We can note, for example, already that this moment of non-being, when it's further unpacked, will mean that any being that is consigned to non-existence. It's finite. It'll end. We know that, we can think ahead that might be the case, but it's not built in here explicitly. So I'm going to go over into quality. The first paragraph just really emphasizes the fact that these two moments are the same, so it's kind of not really taking us forward, but I'll read it to you anyway. Because of the immediacy of the oneness of being and nothing in determinate being, they do not extend beyond each other. So far as determinate being is in the form of being, so far is it non-being, so far as it is determinate. Being is not the universal, and determinateness is not the particular. That relation between the universal and the particular is a much later one that you can't apply here. And indeed, determinateness, has not yet severed itself from being, and indeed it will no more sever itself from being absolutely, although it gets pretty close in essence. For the truth from which now on underlies them as ground is the unity of non-being with being. Okay, so the next thought that takes us on a little bit is stated in the next paragraph. Determinateness, thus isolated by itself in the form of being, is quality, which is wholly, simple, and immediate. So this is die Bestimmtheit so für sich isoliert. Das Sein der Bestimmtheit ist die Qualität. So take the idea of, which one was I working with? So, we start with the idea of being and non-being as a unity, as an immediate unity, as a form of being in a sense. To think of them as a unity is to think of them as immediately one, is to put the emphasis on this. But of course, Dasein is as much negative as it is positive. So we need to focus on non-being. And specifically, non-being in its unity with being. So this very constellation, only as it were with the accent on that rather than the accent on that. How do we think that? How do we think non-being that is? Now we don't have a nice adjective like the Germans do. The Germans have the adjective Seiend. And we say we can't use being as an adjective, like being chair. But the Germans have, they have an adjective Seiend, which comes from sein. So what Hegel's talking about here, it's translated, determinateness thus isolated by itself in the form of being. The German is die Bestimmtheit as Sein der Bestimmtheit, as Bestimmtheit that is, as non-being that is. So the emphasis on non-being, but as non-being that is, that he calls quality. Okay? So this is called quality. So quality is just determinate being, but with a negative accent in one sense, but a negative accent that is itself affirmative. Non-being that is, determinacy that is quality. So determinate being is quality. Hence the title of this whole section. This whole section is quality. So being has proven to be not just becoming, not just determinate, but quality. And note, it's proven to be quality before there's anything to which the quality can attach. And this is really important. Hegel is much closer in method from that point of view to Spinoza than he is to Aristotle. For Aristotle, if you're going to think about properties, then you've got to have something to which they attach. But for Spinoza, that's not true. For Spinoza, the things we engage with, the modes, are modes of something, substance, that in some respects is not even a thing. So it's not obvious that Aristotelian way of looking at things is the right way of doing it. And Hegel doesn't start with that. So he starts by simply highlighting the idea that determinacy, understood as inseparable from being, as non-being that is quality. But then you will say, well, hang on, but we still haven't given non-being its due as non-being. Don't we have to think quality itself as non-being? Sorry about my terrible handwriting. You can make out roughly what the signs are meant to mean. Non-being is where the emphasis is on that. Yes, we do. That, then, is quality with a negative accent. And Hegel names that negation. But once you've got this, quality as negation, then this is now set in relation to this as different from it. So quality is now not just what it is on its own, but quality that differs from negation. Affirmative quality, if you like, that differs from negation. The name that he gives that now is reality. So this now comes to be understood as reality. This now, that is negation. And that really is the end of the dialectic of Dasein for the minute. And you can see you've sort of done everything you've got to do. So, Dasein is being and the negative that is itself one with being, so being and non-being together as one. But insofar as they're one, they form an immediacy, so that's privileging being. But the negative is equally important, so we've equally got to highlight, emphasize, accentuate the non. So we have to think this very unity, not something different, this unity, only with an accent on the non. That gives us non-being that is, or determinacy that is, Sein der Bestimmtheit, which he names quality. But that doesn't quite do it either. That doesn't do justice to the negative, because it's non-being that is. But that's also non-being that is. That is quality with a negative accent. That's negation. Negation is just negative quality. But that then affects retrospectively this. So this is now not just quality on its own, but a one-sided quality with an affirmative accent, and that is reality. So negation converts quality as such into reality. And so these are your two constituents of determinate being. What determinate being proves to be is quality that consists in reality and negation. Now look at the text in a minute, because I just want to show you, because the story I've given relies on the German, and Miller kind of slightly misunderstands the text. So what you get here is, first of all, the emergence of a difference. No, this difference doesn't disappear. Okay, unlike the difference between being and nothing, this difference doesn't disappear. It's a determinate difference that's constitutive of determinate being. It's what determinate being consists in minimally. Being real, being negative. And yet, you'll see that they're both kind of defined in the same way. So it's almost as if the price you have to pay for getting determinate difference is a sameness at some level with a difference of accent. Looking back, being and nothing, there was no sameness at all. They were absolutely and utterly distinct. Pure being, pure nothing. But that vanished. That was unsustainable. A sustainable determinate difference has emerged only when you've got the same logical structure with different accents. But we do now have a determinate difference. The fact that there is a certain sameness between them, though, means that each, in fact, is concealed in the other. Non-being that is still a form of quality, and so conceals reality within it. So we can put a little r there in brackets. Reality, that's non-being that is, conceals non-being that is, and so conceals negation. So Hegel argues that, in fact, these two moments do not vanish into one another. They are settled, stable. But each implicitly contains the other. But because it only implicitly contains the other, we think that it doesn't. And so we think that reality is just real, is real, is real. And we come up with, the ens realissimum, in which there's no negation at all. We're wrong, but it's understandable why we would think like that. So what I find interesting about these concepts is they both explain why we would misunderstand each term, and that we misunderstand, or put it the other way, Hegel's account shows us the concepts, how they should be understood properly, and why we would misunderstand them. And the misunderstanding is something we're seduced into, as it were, by the concept itself, because the determinate difference puts the two as just distinct, even though each implicitly contains the other. But we don't always recognize that. And metaphysics doesn't recognize this. And indeed, even certain critics of metaphysics don't recognize this. Okay, it's, I think because it's 5:02 and the noise is off at the outside, I think I need to take you through the relevant paragraph here. But at least you've got the basic structure of this. You know what's going on. We'll come back. I'll start next time by going through this again, tying it to the text more closely. I want to say a little bit about the remark. If you read the remark, and particularly the idea that Hegel comes up with, that if you were to deprive reality of all negation, you would lose determinacy, you would have pure being, and so you would have nothing. Ergo, the ens realissimum, the certain God of metaphysics, is nothing. We didn't need Nietzsche to tell us that. Hegel's logic is already telling us that. Then we'll go on to something, and how determinate being generates the very idea of there being something at all, and then we'll look at that. Good. All right, well, thanks very much for your patience. Sorry we didn't get to discuss this at the end, but we'll do it next time.